With that, let me introduce our presenter today. Dr. Daniel Gruner is a professor of entomology at the University of Maryland, College Park. His lab's research focuses on insect ecology, food web interactions, biodiversity in ecological communities, and the impacts of insects on ecosystem processes. Welcome, Dr. Gruner.
Thank you so much, Grace. It really is a pleasure to be with you all on this Saturday morning. And I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is periodical cicadas. So let me go ahead and share that screen and welcome your questions if there's something really confusing along the way. Otherwise, I hope to leave plenty of time for questions at the end as well. All right, so I want to tell you a story today about particularly the Brood X, which appeared in the DC area in 2021. It is also the largest of all of the cicada broods, and I'll explain what broods are in a few minutes. But that large brood, which covers much of the eastern, a number of states in the east and the south east, came out in 2021 to great fanfare, and we wanted to see how it might disrupt forest ecosystems given the sheer numbers that we expected from the cicada emergence. So today, I'll first start with a review of periodical cicada biology, and then we'll talk about a little bit of ecological theory on resource pulses and trophic cascades. Then we'll get into our study and tell you about our results there. Sneak preview, the answer is yes. And then we'll talk about some applications and some outreach and even some ways that you can contribute to growing data sets on periodical cicadas. But first, let's look back in time a little bit. Periodical cicadas have always been a source of wonder and confusion and consternation. These are some records from early colonists from North America, but there are plenty of reports of indigenous people consuming them and taking note of them well prior to the colonists. But this one notes the second governor of Massachusetts in 1633, all the month of May, there was such a quantity of a great sort of flies, like for bigness to wasps or bumblebees, which came out of holes in the ground and ate green things and made such a constant yelling noise as made all the woods ring of them and ready to deaf the hearers. And it goes on in 1666. This is a little more difficult to read. It's in old style text, but this was Henry Oldenburg's observations that needed later on to be revised a bit. A great observer who hath lived long in New England did upon occasion relate to a friend of his in London, where he lately was, that some few years since there was such a swarm of a certain sort of insects in that English colony that for the space of 200 miles, they, and I'm not sure what that says, and destroyed all the trees of that country, there being found innumerable little holes in the ground out of which those insects broke forth in the form of maggots, which turned into flies that had a kind of a tail or, again, not sure what that one says, which they struck into the tree and thereby envenomed and killed it. So the myths begin to spread. And here's the great one from the Maryland Gazette out of Annapolis in 1751. We are informed in some places the locusts have been found in great plenty, just under the surface of the earth, almost at their full growth. May God avert our impending calamities. So that's one of the more fun quotes that we have historically. But I should note that people continue to confuse these with locusts, which of course are really a kind of grasshopper. So they're not locusts. They don't swarm and consume all of our crops. The locusts and grasshoppers, of course, have huge hind legs for hopping and long antennae and relatively long bodies, and they chew. They have chewing mouth parts. Whereas cicadas have hind legs about the same size as their other legs. They're good for climbing and perching, shorter antennae, and cicadas suck fluids from trees. They feed on the xylem, as we'll talk about in a bit, and they do not swarm. They emerge by the billions and sometimes the trillions, but they don't swarm as locusts do. So cicadas writ large are global, they're diverse, and they're very loud. And you could say probably proud as well. There are at least 55 tribes, more than 450 genera, and more than 3,000 species of cicadas worldwide in every continent except Antarctica. And these include the loudest known insects. There's an African cicada, and its loudest song is almost 107 decibels, single individual, when measured at a distance of 20 inches away. That's almost as loud as a chainsaw. And you hear them in a lot of places you go around the world. In Malaysian Borneo, where I had the great thrill to visit last year, they were very loud, a number of species. There was one, the 6 o'clock cicada, that every evening started to chorus right around 6. It was more like 6:05. And then there was what we call the tea kettle cicada, which sound disturbingly similar to a tea kettle that has come to boil. But they can be as colorful as butterflies, really, and they're very diverse. So if you live in the eastern United States, or even out west, there are cicadas. We generally call these the annual cicadas, or sometimes the dog day cicadas, because their populations often peak in August. These feed underground like our periodical cicadas, so they take some 2 to 8 years to develop, and some adults emerge every year. So they're not synchronized as our periodical cicadas are, and we hear them every summer in July and August, especially on the hottest, most humid days of the summer. They appear in late July, mid-August. They're greenish in color, and they're quite agile. Their survival strategy is stealth and speed, probably because they don't come out in great numbers. They have a number of defense mechanisms from things that would like to eat them. Periodical cicadas, on the other hand, they take 13 or 17 years to develop, depending on the species. They emerge en masse, as in up to 1.5 million per acre. They appear in mid-May to June, so they don't overlap temporally. If you're in a periodical cicada area and you're hearing cicadas, they won't overlap in time with the dog day cicadas. And they have these striking red eyes with orange wing venation. And in rare cases, they actually can have white or blue eyes, but usually this blood red color. And their survival strategy, we think, is really predator satiation. They come out in such huge numbers that all of the gorging predators simply can't eat them all. And so why do we have this unusual phenomenon where we have these 13 and 17-year periodical cycles for cicadas? This is a really long lifespan, and combined with the periodicity is unique to the North American genus we call Magic cicada, which has just the 7 species. There are other periodical cicadas in the world. There's an 8-year periodical cicada in Fiji, and there's a 4-year periodical cicada in India, which is called the World Cup cicada, because those are the years when they emerge. But truly periodical organisms are really quite rare and really quite fascinating. So with these ones that are 13 and 17 years in their periodicity, there's a few hypotheses, and these are not mutually exclusive. One idea for a while was that they come out in these prime numbers. Prime numbers are only divisible by 1 and by that same number. And so it was thought that specialists that might try to, that might co-evolve with cicadas, say if they came out every 2 years or 3 years, it's hard to imagine how they might specialize on such a strange cycle of 13 or 17 years. More well-supported hypotheses include that the life cycle is long because they feed on a very nutritionally poor resource. They feed on the xylem, or the sap coming up from the roots that's mostly water, and that really doesn't have a lot of nutrients, doesn't have sugars in it, and so they must feed for a long time to get enough of those critical things they need. And of course, we also feel that the synchronized emergence acts to satiate predators, and I'll show you some evidence for that. But getting into their feeding, I mentioned they feed on xylem. This is the watery sap that comes up from the roots. It contains perhaps a few mineral elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's mostly water. It also has a different function as well, we think, for xylem feeders, and that's evaporative cooling. This is like when your dog pants on a hot day and has a very wet tongue, and they openly pant because they can't sweat, and that as the water evaporates from their tongues, it has a cooling effect, just like when we sweat. And with these particular desert cicadas, this is a graph showing the rate of water loss against time. And as you increase the temperature, you start at 25 degrees Celsius and you start to increase the temperature in a lab study. The water loss is not high until you start to reach 41 to 42 degrees Celsius, which translate to above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the rate of water loss just jumps through the roof, increases by approximately 600%. And this is the water loss across the insect's cuticle. By feeding on xylem and tapping into this water source, water's cheap, really. They can afford to lose water through their cuticle so long as they're actively feeding, and thus cool themselves on the very hot day that they might face in the desert. And this, incidentally, is one reason we think that they're very active on the hottest, most humid days of the summer. But xylem is also a nutritionally very poor resource. If you were to take me and put me in a drying oven and then analyze my elemental nutrient content, you would find I'm a little more than 10% nitrogen. And this is true for other animals and insects, where we all have at least 10% or around that level of our bodies is nitrogen. And so we need lots of nitrogen for our amino acids and proteins and many other functions within our cells. But when you start looking at plant material, the nitrogen levels are much lower. So this is the nitrogen content of seeds. You can see the range that you might find in different seeds, ranging from about 1 to very close to 10%, more like 8% or so in some seeds. But then you get into the foliage, it's less. Then you get into the phloem, which is the sap that's translocated from the leaves. It contains sugars from the photosynthesis process, transported to other parts of the plants. Lower nitrogen still, but when you get to the xylem, which is coming up from the roots, you have a real high range spanning about 5 to 6 orders of magnitude, where you can have exceptionally low levels of nitrogen in the xylem. And remember, the cicadas are up here. They need 10% or more in their body content of nitrogen for them to grow and survive and reproduce. So it's a poor resource. And this probably explains why it takes them a very long time. And it's worth taking a long time if you're an ent or if you're a cicada. And this figure here shows on the upper right, we can see the differences in size from the different instars. The first instar, which hatches out on the same year as the emergent event for the cicadas, all the way up to the final instar, which is the 5th, and this is the one that will eventually crawl up out of the ground and molt into an adult. But except for the first instar, which it molts out of generally within that first year, for 17-year cicadas, it takes on average about 4 years for them to pass through each of these larval instars. And so basically there's 16 years for them to get to maturity in the 5th instar and be ready to emerge. And then in the 17th year, they emerge. And so that's a very long time to be underground consuming this xylem fluid. And probably in large part that's due to the low value of the resource nutritionally. But even so, when they do come out, there are a lot of things that will eat them. It's quite amazing to watch how all the animals react to them, even before they emerge, actually. When they create their holes, their exit tunnels in the ground, you'll see foxes and other animals trying to dig them up from underground. But once they emerge as these final stage nymphs and then molt into adults, you'll see squirrels and all kinds of birds, and also your dogs and your cats consuming cicadas. And of course, humans consume cicadas more as kind of a artisanal thing in this country currently, but many cultures are known to consume cicadas. And here's a really striking story about predator satiation and the ability to, if you come out in huge numbers, all of those predators that you have, even with the diversity of players that are eating you, if there's enough of you, you can overcome and overwhelm those predators and satiate them and have a large fraction of surviving adults. So this is the percent predation, and this is the standing crop. So you can see when they really start to peak, there's a big gap between the standing crop and the percent of those that are consumed. And it's only really about 15% of the total adult cicada population. So emerging in mass would seem, in a synchronized manner, would seem to be adaptive in this case. So getting into the different broods. So a brood is basically a spatial and temporal unit. These are areas where the populations of 17-year or 13-year cicadas are synchronized on the same yearly cycle. So they're indicated different colors here. The 17-year cicadas, there are 12 different broods, each coming out in a different year in a different place. And there are 3 broods of the 13-year cicadas. And so what's really special about this year, in 2021, we had the largest brood, Brood X, in terms of geographic coverage. This year, we have really odd conjoinment here of 2 broods emerging in the same year. So we have a 13-year brood, that's Brood XIX, shown here in this light blue color, and Brood XIII in 2024. This is really concentrated around Illinois, southern Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, southern Michigan. But the last time these 2 broods came out in the same year, and remember those strange prime numbers we have, those 13 and 17-year cycles, the last time this happened was when there was a very small land deal ongoing called the Louisiana Purchase, and Thomas Jefferson was president. So 21 years ago. But really, another take home from this is nearly every year, not every year, you look back at 2022 and 2023, we didn't have broods emerging in those years, but nearly every year in at least one location around the eastern US, we have at least one brood emerging. There are 7 species of magic cicada, as I've mentioned, and this is kind of a diagram showing their evolutionary history as inferred from a genomic work that Chris Simon and others have put together over the years. And what's really striking about these is that there are really 3 groups that are well supported in terms of being distinct lineages that split off from each other at about 3.9 million years ago for the first time, separating the Bothersome group from the 2 groups, Cassini and Decula, which themselves split at about 2.5 million years. But if you look below that, and then there's a more recent split for this 7th species, but each of these pairs here that you see are independent lineages that independently evolved a 13-year and a 17-year brood. So that happened 3 different times independently in these 3 lineages. The downside of that is that it's very difficult to tell them apart genomically, visually, and even by their song or their chorus. So the 13-year Neotradecum, named for the 13 years, and this one that's Septemdecim, 17 years. Very difficult to tell those 2 apart just by looking at them. Now, I showed you a brood map, but this shows more broadly the map of all of the 17-year cicada broods and the 13-year broods. And what's striking here is that there are 2 species that among the 13-year cicadas that don't really spatially overlap much, and these most recently split from each other. Here we have the Neotradecum in this kind of area that sits between the 17-year and the 13-year cicadas, and this one has the Tradecum, but they don't overlap a lot. And it's thought that some of this might explain maybe some of the splits between the 13 and 17-year evolutionarily, which is happening kind of in a zone where there might be hybridization that has occurred historically. So to get into the life cycle of these guys, what I'm showing you here is the newly emerged first instar nymph. It's a ghostly little thing, very small, about the size of a grain of rice, and it's just juxtaposed on an adult, which of course is no longer living. By the time that these are hatching, most of the adults have died off for the year. But the full life cycle is here. And so what we first see in the spring of a given emergence year is we'll see these holes start to appear in the ground underneath trees, and they will sit and wait up to 3 to 5 weeks after they've burrowed out an exit from their underground chambers. And they seem to wait for the temperature and humidity to be of correct levels for them. There's a minimum temperature that we think that they adhere to. And so once it exceeds that temperature and the other conditions are right, they'll begin to emerge. Those that don't do so synchronously are quickly removed from the population by predators. But at some point it becomes overwhelming to the point where it's not possible to consume them all. Once they emerge, then usually at nighttime, they will crawl up trees or branches or foliage and start that final molt from the 5th instar larvae into an adult. Once they're out of that cuticle, the exoskeleton, they will hang from a structure and expand and dry their wings so that by morning, with any luck, they'll be able to move around and even to fly. So it's thought that they do this mostly at night because a lot of their predators are visual predators, like you see here with this grackle. Everything is trying to consume them then at this point. They reach adulthood, and within 4 to 6 days or so, they've finally hardened all of their various parts, which includes the tymbals, which are membranes, kind of like a speaker, the membranes in a speaker or in a drum that's internal on the males. And that's basically a vibrating membrane with hollow abdomen that is able to propagate this tremendous noise that they make. Once they've chorused, the males have attracted females and they've mated, then the females will begin to inject their egg nests onto pencil-sized twigs. So they inject them into these branches that can cause some damage to those twigs. They lay a series of eggs in there, and within 3 to 6 weeks or so, those eggs will hatch. these little ghostly guys will start to crawl out, and then they'll drop to the ground and find their way into the soil, and they'll begin to grow on the roots of grasses and small plants before molting into the next instar and migrating down to the roots of deciduous trees. Right, so that's their full life cycle. In ecology, we think of processes like cicada emergences as resource pulses. So this is where you have an infrequent, large magnitude and short duration event that massively increases resource availability in a system. And so you think of horseshoe crabs, for instance, on the coast of Delaware, that have these brief pulses where there are many, many individuals. We think of Pacific salmon coming up to spawn after spending several years at sea and providing massive inputs of resources. We also see masting of many trees, and especially in the tropics, but also in oaks, where they'll have big acorn crops, right? Many years of low acorn crops and then a big year, which we call masting, is also a resource pulse. And cicadas, if I can get this going here, it's supposed to be a video. It's outside my, in my yard as they emerged in early May of 2021. The numbers can be mind-boggling. This is just under a street tree by the road. But they provide just a huge input of biomass into the system for predators to consume. A 1960s study that estimated in a floodplain forest near Chicago that there were up to 3,600 kilograms of cicadas per hectare, which is about 3,200 pounds per acre, which still remains the largest terrestrial animal biomass per area ever recorded in the wild. So huge resource pulse over those few weeks when they emerge. Now, this has ecological impacts, which is really the meat of what I'd like to convey to you today. This is a study from Louis Yang, who really was the first to kind of align this idea of resource pulses with what cicadas are doing. And he did experiments where he went with big garbage bags and collected cicada carcasses from large areas and then added those cicada carcasses to research plots and compared them against controls. So in each of these plots, we have the control on the left, the cicada addition on the right, and we can see for foliage nitrogen, this is for an American bellflower that was monitored for this. For foliage nitrogen, you had a big increase in the nitrogen in bellflowers after cicada fertilization. You also had an increase in the stable isotope ratio for 15N, which is kind of a marker of animal-derived nitrogen. When you add the cicadas, it's then taken up by the bellflowers. And the resulting seed mass for these bellflowers also increases when you add cicadas. Others have studied this as well to see what the effects are on more of a regional scale. And this study by Koenig and Leibold showed that radial growth of oaks declined during the year of emergence and in the following year, but then dramatically increased in year +2. So these two graphs show studies from within the range of 13-year and 17-year cicadas. We have the emergence year, and we have oaks, which we know the cicadas will happily oviposit on and also feed upon the roots. And that's compared to a control, which is pines. They don't go for conifers. So they're not on the roots of pines, and they're not attacking the twigs of pines. So for oaks, we see in both cases that the mean standardized growth in terms of looking at the diameter increment growth of these oaks is much lower in the year of emergence, and it begins to recover in the years following so that it's higher in the years to follow. There are other effects as well, and sticking with oaks. So this is a study that measured the percentage fruit abortion, that is the acorns that are are dropped by the tree before they become mature. And as the damage from cicada increases in percentage here from 5 to up to close to 25%, you have increasing likelihood that you're going to have abortion of many of your acorns before they're mature. And then another study at the regional scale, again by Koenig and colleagues, published very recently, showed that in the year of emergence, the acorn crop is much lower than the historical average. So that's this dotted line here, that's the average over time. And the year following emergence, it's still down. But then in year 2 after emergences, we see this really large uptick in acorn crops. And if you were in the area of Brood X, especially in the Washington, D.C. area in 2023, we had a huge acorn crop last year. So at least that observation seems to support what they're proposing. And there are some hypotheses for these effects on tree growth and acorn production. One is that there's all this feeding on the xylem by nymphs underground that has this chronic effect, and only when released from all of these large insects do they finally recover and start to grow more and to produce more acorns. Follow-up studies on this have not come up with great evidence in support of this idea. There's more supportive evidence for this second hypothesis, which is the oviposition damage on stems and twigs. It damages them enough during that emergence year that it takes them a couple years to recover. But is there another hypothesis? So that's the focus of our research that was recently published in Science on the cover. And if you are a scientist, you know how thrilling this is. If you're not a scientist, then let me tell you that once this happens, you basically can retire to the Bahamas for your career, because this is extremely hard to do, and we were very lucky, really. But it's a big deal. So I want to introduce you to the team. So this is really led by postdoc Zoe Getman-Pickering and by Martha Weiss at Georgetown University and John Lill at George Washington University. Then I come from the University of Maryland. Grace was my undergraduate honors student who did a lot of the bird work in this study. And then Sarah was also a Georgetown University student. So our research question is really asking, what are the consequences of a massive pulse of insect biomass for the surrounding ecological communities? So do they disrupt the food webs in forest ecosystems? And here's another sort of ecological jargon term for you that you might have heard of, is the idea of trophic cascades. And this has been studied in a lot of different systems. And we now have quite a lot of good evidence from studies where birds are excluded from trees to allow the herbivorous insects to grow without bird predation. And often what we see is this indirect effect that's positive towards the plants, because the birds consume these insects. The insects feed less on the plants, allowing them to grow more, which is this indirect positive interaction for the presence of birds in these systems. And birds are really important predators of plant-feeding insects, in particular spiders and caterpillars. To fledge a single brood of cicadas, a study estimated that a pair of nesting birds must collect between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, just that single pair. So I want to put up a hypothesis then for what we might see if the cicadas are super abundant and the birds like to consume them. And that we call that apparent facilitation. It's a little jargony, I admit, but it's really the cicadas are essentially facilitating the caterpillars, but they're not doing so directly. They're not providing them nutrition or a place to live or other direct assistance. The way they're facilitating the caterpillars is by stepping in and volunteering to be eaten by the birds and distract the birds while the caterpillars increase their numbers. And the caterpillars increasing their numbers should mean that we see increased herbivory on white oaks and other sorts of plants where those caterpillars are feeding. So we went out and did bird observations. I'll show you a few methods that we've used. A lot of the bird studies were done by Grace, also by Sarah, by myself, and by Zoe, collecting observations of foraging behaviors and trying to determine whether birds are foraging on cicadas or foraging on something else. And so during the peak 6-week period where there were plenty of cicadas around, we see that in every case, they're eating a lot of food that is cicadas, and sometimes up to 70% of their diet is cicadas. So they altered their diets to include cicadas when they're present. And 17-year cicadas, they're out. That's a longer lifespan than most of the birds, if not all of the birds that would be feeding on them. So this is a completely novel resource that they very quickly learn to utilize. We also combined that with some community science work where people were contributing observations of birds feeding upon cicadas around the state of Maryland. And altogether, there were more than 80 species that were confirmed to prey upon cicadas. And these include some things you'd expect, like cardinals and mid-sized birds, but also includes things like red cockaded woodpeckers and peregrine falcons, trumpeter swans, geese, turkey vultures, even tiny little blue-gray gnatcatchers. So the full spectrum of size and different types of food habits of birds were all picking up the cicadas opportunistically. Then there was some studies we did where we wanted to monitor the predation that was going on with predators on caterpillars. And the best way to really do this in a repeatable way over time is to use model caterpillars, which are made of clay, and the clay can record those bird strikes. So you put these out for a week, you bring them back from the field, and you can see the evidence of the birds attacking them. You can also see evidence of insect attempts and mammals, so that you can discern those different types of predators. And this is what I call the money slide. So this really very conclusively shows the predation pressure as measured by birds that are willing to take a taste of these clay caterpillars over time. We did this in 2020 before the cicada emergence, in 2021 while cicadas were emerging, and the year following when there weren't cicadas. And you can see that 2020 and 2022 are very similar through time, from the beginning of May all through August, whereas when the cicadas emerged, birds nearly ignored these clay caterpillars, especially during the peak times of the cicadas' presence in these forests. But then those numbers recovered later on as the cicada supply dried up. So very strong evidence that the bird strikes declined by up to 75% compared to non-emergence years. Then there was a very labor-intensive part of the study that went out and measured the numbers of caterpillars on white oak trees. The team eventually looked at over 40,000 leaves, checking for all manner of caterpillars underneath the leaves, on top of the leaves, and then ranking them to species. And that happened in May, early May, before the cicadas really were expected to emerge, and then in June, really during the peak of cicada presence. And what we found is, and this one we didn't have 2020 data, so we did 2 years following the cicada emergence in 2022 and 2023. And in May, when there are no cicadas around, this is very early May, numbers were really not different across these 3 years. But in 2021, in June, we can see essentially a doubling of free-feeding caterpillars that were benefiting from the presence of cicadas. And if we look a little more in depth in one of the more abundant caterpillars, Acronicta, we see this also in their size structure in their population. So in 2021, in the presence of cicadas, more than half of the Individual caterpillars were third to fifth instar, so they're much larger caterpillars. Large caterpillars are sitting ducks for predators, as opposed to 2022 and 2023, when a very small fraction were actually these larger caterpillars. Most of them were small that were able to escape predators at those time. And their abundances follow the same patterns that we saw on the last data slide. And their damage, in line with trophic cascade theory, increased when the caterpillars did. So compared to 2020 and 2022, in 2021, there was approximately a doubling in damage to white oak leaves from caterpillars when they were essentially facilitated by our cicadas. So in our conclusion in this part, then, the mass emergence of periodical cicadas really did rewire the food web. The birds basically lost interest in many of their typical prey items. We didn't measure fruits for frugivorous birds and many other resources in the forest, but it'd be really interesting to go and do that and see if we see similar results with predation on other types of resources when the cicadas are abundant. There was also other activity outside the forest landscape. In row crops of brassica, there was a 340% increase in Pyrrhus rapi caterpillars that feed on brassica in row crops in the spring of 2021 compared with the prior 2 years. And there were localized outbreaks of eastern tent caterpillars in 2022, the year after this event, suggesting that more of them survived in 2021 and were able to lay the groundwork for that crop in 2022. There are some potential human health impacts. They're pretty diffuse, and one is extremely minor but a little irritating. So if you spend a lot of time underneath the egg nests where cicadas have been ovipositing, there's a resurgence of these oak leaf itch mites. They're there all the time, but they really do well if they have the shelters of these egg nests from cicadas, and you'll find yourself itching. That's why they're called itch mites. And so that year in 2021, we really had a lot of entomologists who came back from the field with these unexplained itchiness. Not long-term impacts, but annoying. And there are potential knock-on effects. So one really interesting thing to look into in the future is perhaps the relationship with cycles for Lyme disease. So contrary to a lot of public opinion, the most predictive mammals for the presence of Lyme that can be transmitted to humans are really the small mammals, the white-footed mice and the squirrels, which have the larval mites on them that have the bacterial pathogen, and those benefit from high acorn crops. So what we find is that 2 years following a high acorn crop in a lot of the Northeast, you will often have a surge in Lyme cases. And so look for that in the DC area and the greater area of Brood X in 2025 as a possibility. All right, so what about cicada damage? There are certainly risks to small saplings and small trees. So nurseries really suffer some consequences from cicada emergence events. There are a few types of trees, all deciduous flowering plants that are the most vulnerable than others. Cicadas don't oviposit into conifers, but if you have a small oak tree that you've planted in the year of emergence, you may want to protect that tree because it's vulnerable in that year. The larger trees don't seem to, they recover quickly from this. It's really the small trees that you've just planted that are the ones to worry about, or the ones still in the nurseries. And that's because they oviposit all these egg nests. They damage those pencil-sized twigs and branches and sometimes kill them. You can see all the dead branches here that'll eventually break off and die, and that's going to impact that plant's ability to recover and to continue to grow. It'll also impact the plant's architecture. And so here's a large tree that really won't have long-term consequences, except maybe minor decreases in growth in that first or second year. And you can see here from a nursery what that often looks like, where you have the branches snapping off because they're so weakened by the oviposition of the adult female cicadas. So I would not recommend going and spraying them with pesticides. If you're in one of these emergence events, it's really like tilting at a windmill. There's just more coming all of the time. And plus you're potentially poisoning a food resource for the birds and the squirrels. So it's also not as effective as just simply netting them, and you might want to consider that for the youngest trees that are the most vulnerable. You don't want to be the cost of spraying every 2 to 3 days in order to keep on top of this problem. And there's all these non-target effects. So it's better to net them than it is, and it's, there's labor associated with that, but it's better than a lot of extra pesticides in the environment. Another suggestion is, if you're going to plant young trees and there's an emergence event that year, maybe wait until the fall to do so, or even the following year. And you can remove damaged twigs and remove those eggs from the system if you're worried about that. All right, so I really would suggest you just enjoy the show. Don't try to kill the cicadas, just enjoy this incredible natural history event, which is so really rare across the world. There are ways you can contribute data and observations as well to these community science efforts. One important one is to get the Cicada Safari app and to go out and take pictures when you see periodical cicadas, and your location will be uploaded then with a photo through the geotag, and it'll contribute to our knowledge of where exactly these broods are geographically. You can also go to Cicada Safari and look to see where people have been seeing them recently as a way to go and find them yourselves. And then the second portal for contributing your data is to add to our data set for bird records. In 2021, we were focused on Maryland, and we have records of more than 20% of all the birds are out there eating cicadas, but that was most likely limited by the amount of data we had. So we welcome continuing observations. If you see a bird somewhere that's feeding on cicadas, it's a simple form that you can just populate. You can also email us through that site with your records. You can upload photos, but that would really contribute for our project going forward. There's also on that site, there's some outreach. So if you're a teacher or no teachers, there's a digital workbook that has various lessons in English and Spanish that you might find fun in the classroom. So here's some sites for more information. The Cicada Mania site is really all things cicada worldwide. So there's tons of information, not just about periodicals, but about cicadas worldwide. The University of Connecticut's site is really the first place you should go to learn about periodical cicadas. It's an incredibly rich site. You can go on there and listen to the choruses of the different species and see all kinds of cool data and facts. Then this site is run jointly by this team with John Lill, Martha Weiss, and myself, Friends to Cicadas. Diane Lill is the one who does the educational component. And then there's folks at UMD Extension, notably Mike Raup and Paula Shrewsbury. Happy to take your questions, or you can go to Mike Raup's blog at Bug of the Week, where he's done some 24 stories on these periodical cicadas. And I'll just leave this open then as my last slide so you can get this information while I take any questions.
Thanks so much, Dan. Our first question is, if someone's in the DC area, where's the closest place where they could see both the 13 and 17-year periodical cicada broods?
So for the 17-year, you're going to have to travel. So you would need to go to Chicago, or other parts of Illinois, those 4 or 5 states right in the Midwest, centered around Illinois, is where you'll see the 17-year. The 13-year span a much broader area. that extends from the very southern tip of Maryland in St. Mary's County. There's just a few populations there. And there's a few sites in Virginia that are east of Richmond and more towards, there's one area more towards Williamsport and one outside of Richmond. So those are very close by, but they spread across 16 states all the way into Oklahoma, and actually going up to the north in Illinois, where there are areas of almost contact with the 17-year cicadas. They don't fully overlap, but they're in the same ballpark, maybe calling across the street from each other. Problem is you really won't be able to tell by looking at them whether they're 13-year or 17-year.
And Dan, you said that the 13-year cicadas and 17-year cicadas sometimes hybridize. Is that right?
That's what we think. When you look at the genomics, not what I think, what the people who are experts in this think, is it's really hard to see much of a signature for each of the two species in each lineage, the 13-year and 17-year, because there's a lot of introgression, which is to say there's a lot of cross gene flow between the two species. So it's likely they occasionally do hybridize. Or at least have in the recent past. Yeah.
We've got someone wondering, how long is the life cycle of other species of cicadas that we see in the US?
Yeah, so for the dog days, they come out really every year. So you might be tempted to say they're annual cicadas, but they're really not. They have they spend time underground anywhere from 2 to 8 years. So they're also limited by this xylem resource that they're on, but they'll just emerge when they're ready, and they'll come out when they're ready, and they're not synchronized at all. But it's a big mishmash of different age cicadas that are likely coming out for our annual dog day cicadas.
It's really interesting. And is it that within that same species or population, you might see different cicadas emerging at different times?
Yeah, I presume so. There are different species of the dog days. So you could be seeing, maybe there are species that are faster than others or slower than others, but as a whole, they span that whole range. And when they emerge, they have lots of evasive behaviors. They're hard to catch. They're fast, strong flyers, as opposed to our periodicals, which are kind of lazy, not lazy, but they appear lazy and appear like bad flyers that really can't escape very well. It's very easy to catch your fill of those.
We've got another great question here. Someone's wondering, how can cicadas survive when most of the country is covered by houses, roads, parking lots, etc., and a lot of the native trees have been cut down? Aren't most cicadas dead or going extinct because of this loss of habitat?
Well, that's a really good question. There are 2 broods that have sort of blinked out in the last few hundred years, and it's likely because of development and cutting down of trees. And whenever I see big trees going down, I have to say, every time I think about Star Wars and all of the voices that were screaming and then were suddenly silent, right? Because there's cicadas on those roots, most likely, and they can't move around well in the soil. So if you take down the big tree, you're going to probably knock out the ones that are there. And so there are some areas like Pasadena, Maryland. I have a colleague there who could not find them at all in 2021, even though she grew up in that area and knows they were there in the last time in 2004 when she was there. And so if you have a lot of development that takes down trees, you can lose local populations. And so they're not safe by any means, but as long as we have trees in our cities and our landscapes, then they're pretty resilient. And I mean, I was seeing them emerge outside my property. This picture here is right outside the lilac tree, right outside my front porch, and they were emerging from street trees, just all along the street from underneath these street trees. So plant a tree, keep a tree, help the tree grow in your neighborhood. And once they emerge, they basically blanket the neighborhood, and they're likely to lay their eggs and drop below your tree. So you'll have them in your own yard in 17 years.
And a related question, does human development or the impact of climate change, do you foresee that having any impact on your research in terms of how cicadas impact forest ecosystems?
That's a good question. So in terms of climate change, it's pretty complicated, but we think that really the main difference between 13-year and 17-year cicadas is that, remember that the 13 years are all to the south of the 17-year cicadas. And so they have more warm growing days where they can feed actively on the roots. And, in a given season, they might have 30 more days that they can actively feed, or even more. And so they probably complete their life cycle earlier, on average 1 year less for each of the instars. And potentially with climate change, we might see some of those species that are in the 17-year groups start to trend that way as well. We see this potentially happening with what we call stragglers. So there are often in the years prior to an emergence, there are cicadas that come out a full 4 years early, which really suggests that they're on that road towards 13, at least some of them, but there's not enough of them really to establish as a 13-year brood. In the cases we've seen, the predators, get them. There just wasn't enough that emerged in this last Brood X event in 2017. But we also sometimes see these 1 year early or 1 year late. And so that could be just the variance that's in the system. And it just doesn't take hold if there are not enough of them that are off cycle.
Got it. Someone is wondering, are there any invasive species of cicada in the U.S.?
None that I can think of, and I could certainly look into that, but certainly, there's a long list of invasive species. I'm not aware of a single cicada that's non-native in the U.S. Yeah.
That's probably good news.
Yes.
We've got someone wondering, do the adult cicadas feed on any other materials when they are above ground?
Well, they really just feed on the xylem of various plants. They're not too choosy, except for avoiding conifers and maybe a few other species. But while they're adults, they do need that water and for evaporative cooling, but perhaps for their metabolic processes. And they process a lot of water. So when they're feeding on the xylem, they're going through the water a lot. And if they're not evaporating it from their cuticle, they're peeing. And one thing that's really notable about being in the midst of one of these broods at its peak is you can kind of lie down beneath a tree and you can see these rainbow colors as the refraction through the cicada pee gives you little mini rainbows around. And the pee is not like our pee. It's not gross and stinky and everything. It's essentially water. So it's pretty fun. It's like a little sprinkler system that's very widespread.
Definitely something to keep an eye out for. Well, speaking of water, someone is wondering, does the amount of rainfall affect brood size at all?
I think that's a good question, but really, really difficult to test. I mean, a lot of questions we still have for periodical cicadas because they have these really long life cycles. And so in 17 years, you could have a couple drought years, a couple really high rainfall years, and it's really hard to say how those impact the ultimate population that comes out. So it's really difficult to understand how that would be tested, even though it is a really good question.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone who attended today and asked fabulous questions. And thank you so much, Dr. Gruner, for joining us for this great lecture, sending us off into the weekend with a lot to think about.